The ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. But how do the ideas and prescriptions of society's elites become the common sense of the moment? Where closing schools, for example, becomes good for education. Where building 1,000-mile-long pipelines is good for the environment, good for employment. Where it's better to deny medical coverage to public sector employees. Why do everyday people like us, who are for the most part are thoughtful and well-intentioned, solemnly support people like Michelle Bachmann?
I don't.
To tackle this question, the Open University welcomes Loyola University Sociology Professor Dr. Lauren Langman, whose presentation today is titled Hegemony, Identity, and the Reproduction of Domination, but Not Always. In addition to teaching at Loyola, Lauren is co-founder of the Global Studies Association of North America. He's widely published on topics related to alienation and globalization. His forthcoming book is titled The Carnivalization of America, and it looks at the role of alienation of youth and their embrace of transgressive lifestyles. Please welcome Lauren Langman.
Well, let me begin by thanking people for giving up what a wonderful Chicago day we have to listen to me rant and rave and ramble, which is what I'm going to do, simply because when I do the academic stuff, I read, and it gets very detailed and very boring, and I'd just like to throw out some miscellaneous thoughts, although I found out that my miscellaneous thoughts cover about 8 pages of notes. And I'd also especially like to thank Robert for asking me, when he asked me about what I'd like to talk about. I mentioned Carnival, which is something I've been working on. I do have one edited collection out, so run out to the bookstore and buy it. It's only $100. Actually, there's a paperback out, which is only $40. It's called The Carnivalization of America. But that involves that would involve a lot of PowerPoints. And that's really much more fun than what I'm going to talk about, because most of those PowerPoints tend to be, a lot of T and A and people yelling "fuck you," and it's just much more fun than dealing with domination, degradation, and denial of humanity, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I guess the first thing I should sort of say, and I think Eric basically covered the first half of my paper, the real question comes down to something very, very simple that you don't need a big fancy academic language to appreciate. Why do people embrace bullshit? And when I'm talking bullshit, I'm really speaking bullshit. Now, a number of you folks, perhaps 5 or 6 or maybe 7 on the outside, were here the last time I spoke at Open University, and I was talking about the Tea Party. And let's just, we all remember them. They still have some influence, but it's sort of, and I said many times, people thought I was crazy. They were right about being crazy, but I was right about the Tea Party, that they would go back to the wormholes that they came from. But when we ask, why would they accept these notions that Obama was a communist, socialist, post-colonial, terrorist, Muslim from Kenya, who was going to basically build the concentration camps for the Tea Party people, and I mean, and we still have some of these birthers left that are still trying to show us that Obama really was born in Kenya rather than in Hawaii, although they just don't understand that Hawaii is still part of the United States. So why do people believe that? And the attempt I offered to explain that, which is really the thesis of what I'm going to talk about today, is because they needed to. Why did they need to? They needed to in order to defend a particular notion of identity, a notion of the superiority of whites over blacks. That it's okay to have a black in the White House as long as he or she is either driving the car or serving the meals or working in the kitchen, not giving the orders to send drones all over the world to kill innocent women and children. And so the idea of Obama not being one of us was necessary to sustain their sense of self. We could tie that in also with their attitudes on birth control and contraception. Now, as most sociologists know, and if you're not a sociologist, you still know it, The vast majority of Americans are sexually active, at least when they get to a certain age. You know, that's like about that. Now it's off 13. Actually, it's about 16 or 17, and remain that way until, let's see, how old am I? I won't say. Okay. The point here is that, you know, why do they want to, you know, limit contraception and abortion when in fact the amount of abortion is really at an all-time low in this country? Because they need to keep women barefoot pregnant in the kitchen to sustain a certain particular identity based on masculinity. And part and parcel of that notion of masculinity is a certain kind of what we use these big words to say what people can't say ordinarily, heteronormativity. That means it's cool to be straight and it's deviant to be gay. And so if you know, the argument that I made then, I didn't use the Gramscian language at that point, but you can understand what the points that I'm going to try to make today. Okay. Now, there's an awful lot that's been written on Gramsci, and there seems to be a little bit of a Gramsci revival going on. And I could give you a nice, logical, coherent lecture on Gramsci, but, you know, you'd probably enjoy watching some stupid television more because it does get boring and get into various details. And most of Gramsci's work is intertwined with this discussion of Italian politics in the 1920s. And I can understand hegemony, but some of the political stuff, it just sort of escapes me, not being part of my own particular culture. What I want to do is bring together two very, very important strands of thought. Gramsci's notions of hegemony and the Frankfurt School notion of personality. Even though Gramsci himself wasn't part of the Frankfurt School, namely he was in Italy at the time and he was doing actual political work, organizing workers, as opposed to writing incomprehensible treatises on dialectics. Well, they're not incomprehensible, it just takes a long time to figure it out. But there's a certain place in which these views do come together. As I've sometimes said, and I'll say it again because it always gets a laugh, if Mussolini, who was not a really nasty fascist like Hitler, I mean, he kept Gramsci in jail. He didn't just take him to the wall and shoot him. But if Mussolini had been kind enough to give Gramsci a psychoanalyst, these are some of the kinds of things that he might have said. Okay. So we begin to raise the question that Eric already mentioned, and I think most are aware of. Why do people act contrary to what is their self-interest? In other words, as Eric was saying, why would we close schools at a time in which the United States' lead in education is declining? Why would we cut government funds to research when places like China, Brazil, India are pouring massive amounts of money into research? That the upshot of our policies and practices is to accelerate our decline. And yet a lot of people will accept it, enough people will accept it to keep the shitheads in office. Let's go back historically, and I can go back historically to the early founding of the United States and some of my other work. But remember, most of the Confederates fighting in the Civil War, most of the Confederate armies, and they were good armies, you know, but most of them consisted of poor whites. Now, a lot of poor whites decided to leave and didn't want to fight. But why would poor whites fight and risk life and limb to sustain the wealth of a small neo-feudal class of plantation owners? That seems like a strange question. Let's go back to 1968. A few people here were born then, were born by then. I said majority, but I don't know. If we go back to what was happening in 1968, Nixon was going to get tough on those unwashed hippies. You know, so was anybody here besides me at Grant Park in '68? Okay, what a bunch of animals! Yeah. We never bathed, showered, right. Stood around naked, dancing, smoking marijuana, and we're about to overthrow the government of the United States and needed to be crushed. And so a number of working class people, beginning with Nixon, it's called the Southern Strategy, a racist strategy, began to support Republicans. This was really clear. This was really clear in 1980 when large numbers of the working class became called the Reagan Democrats, put Reagan in office. And how did Reagan reward the workers? He basically fired the airline traffic controllers who didn't want money, they just wanted decent working conditions. And to this day, we've seen the power, Bill, I don't know where Bill is, he's back there. Bill can talk about the decline of the working class movement. Kim is back there, about what happened to the working classes as a result of their having, supported Republicans. They basically screwed themselves big time. But boy, they sure got even with those hippies. They get even. They lost their houses, their jobs, their benefits, but they showed those hippies a thing or two.
Right.
The neoliberal policies that have devastated American workers have all but annihilated, actually just have annihilated, possibilities of mobility. We mentioned climate change denial. This is the warmest record that science has ever recorded. We saw a horrible hurricane just about annihilate the East Coast, and it struck very close to home because my daughter was visiting at the time and she couldn't fly back. And my daughter is wonderful, for those that know her, but in small doses. And so because of Hurricane Sandy, we had to put up with her for another 4 days. But she's basically okay. So how do we get people that deny that climate change exists, or maybe it exists, but it has nothing to do with the way with our lifestyles and energy consumption? Why do so many people think that capitalism is the best system that is ever created, that gives people freedom and opportunity and all of that? And it does, actually, for about somewhere in the vicinity of 3 to 4% of the population. And we know, those of us that believe in that world of reality, not the world where they make up new facts, but the world of reality, that mobility has declined and that the average standard of living has at best remained stagnant, but in many cases has actually declined. Okay, for classical Marxism, and that's the stuff that Eric was beginning to quote, and many of us have our roots there. For classical Marxism, there's a problem of false consciousness. But that concept of false consciousness, it raises a number of issues. And I know that many of my own comrades still believe that it's an important, useful concept. And in fact, the differences between my position and their position are the kind of things we usually debate in academic halls with 3 to 7 of our closest friends in the audience. But I think it does make an important difference, because the idea of false consciousness, basically, it becomes to blame the victim. That why are people stupid? It's their own fault for acting stupidly. But there is hope. If they listen to the scientific teachings of a vanguard party, they will be informed. And so if they listen to a vanguard party, and a communist party at that, they will be able to free their minds from the distortions, etc. So only an authoritarian party that preaches scientific socialism is capable of interpreting the world, and those interpretations should suffice for the masses of followers of those parties. I think you can see why I don't particularly subscribe to that view, although my view in many ways, it comes out very similar, but I think that the concept of humanity that undergirds these different approaches is central. Okay, now I want to suggest that there is an alternative possibility, and this is the notion of hegemony that I want to come to, but the notion of hegemony can first be traced to the work of Karl Marx. For example, and Eric was sort of talking about this, when Marx talked about religion being the opiate of the people. Why so? Well, first of all, whenever that's mentioned, we should also go back to his earlier comments that prayer is the wail of the oppressed. And that what else could the people do? They were working 12, 14 hours a day in the satanic mill sweatshops. They would retire to these hovels fit for pigs. Working class of Manchester is just an ideal discussion of the way people lived. And the only thing really left was religion. Religion provided them with some sense of, I'll talk about this later, some source of meaning, some source of dignity, and some sort of hope for a better world. Too bad it's the next world, but not this one. But the larger historical study shows that this was not the first time religion acted as a form of hegemonic domination. That this has been going on for a very, very long time. One could say the same thing about the Indian caste system. Why would people regard these particular caste taboos so sacred that you couldn't you couldn't walk in somebody else's shadow or wash their dishes or anything like that? These were the doctrines that were preached generally by the Brahmins that supported the Brahmin class, and kept the system, a caste-based occupational system, quite stable. But nobody would dare question it, because if you questioned the caste system and violated its taboos, you'd have to go back to being a cockroach and start all over again to ascend. And someday you might get to be a Brahmin. We can say the same thing. I could talk for the rest of the day, but I'm not going to, about the other religions of the world. We could talk about the religions of Egypt, etc. But religions have generally supported the interests of the ruling classes, and even at times where they may question the ruling classes, eventually they wind up getting incorporated. As Eric put it, the ideas of all society, the ideas of the ruling classes, and Marx was right, but what Marx didn't also talk about is how the system of the ruling classes also engendered, and this is on the ground, not coming from up on top, but on the ground, counter-hegemonic ideologies. In other words, those hegemonic ideologies, those values that everybody believed, skewed a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't want to stick with them, and they created the openings for what I'll later talk about, the counter-hegemonic ideologies. These notions, I think, were very clear in some of Marx's work, especially, for example, the 18th Brumaire, where he talks about the French peasants' support for Louis Napoleon. Louis Napoleon was sort of the George Bush of his time, a complete incompetent fool who basically served the ruling classes. And as Marx showed, that the interests of the rural peasants were to support the urban proletariat. But for a variety of reasons, they were, in Marx's words, like, you know, potatoes in a sack, with limited education, limited communication, and without knowing any better, they supported a pseudo-military hero. That's if you remember George Bush in the, you know, flight suit and the padded jockstrap, showing what a great soldier he really was. Okay. Now, to begin with what I'm talking about, I'd have to get into a lot of detail that I want to skip, but quite importantly, with the Second International, the Communist Party had become the official mouthpiece of what's sometimes called scientific socialism or sometimes economism, where everything was automatically reduced to economic factors. No sooner, before the ink was even dried, this had engendered at least two very, very important critiques. Despite this is academic and all that, I'll go fast, I won't bore you. The work of Karl Korsch, who was a philosopher who defended the importance of philosophy, and the work of Gerd Lukács, another philosopher, who basically argued, having not read the manuscripts, but basically argued that one of the major means by which the ruling classes maintained their domination was through the control of consciousness. That is to say, the reified qualities of consciousness in which bourgeois thought was already embedded in our logic came to certain conclusions, and among those conclusions were the limitations of the working classes to understand their own position. And insofar as they failed to understand their own position in society, they were less able to act as a revolutionary force. So now these were the intellectual currents that gave rise to the Frankfurt School. I don't want to talk too much about the Frankfurt School, I'll say a few things later. Meanwhile, and we're now sort of the early 1900s, 1920, 1930, and a Sicilian Italian communist labor organizer, that's of course Antonio Gramsci, was trying to organize the peasants of the South and the industrial workers of the North, but he ran into a brick wall. And what was that brick wall? That the workers wouldn't listen to him. And why wouldn't the workers listen to him? Because their priests told them that the communists were atheists, hedonists, and if they followed those communists, they would be excommunicated in this world, and they would never get to heaven, and they would have to spend their all eternity in hell listening to academic lectures forever and ever and ever. So given the choice between joining the Communist Party and spending all eternity listening to lectures like this, they opted out and didn't go with the Communist Party. But this is what, you know, Weber then began to understand, what Gramsci understood in terms of the tremendous power of religion. We might also note, as a little, just as a side note, with the election of our new Pope, and I have no idea of whether or not he was actually involved in the dirty wars of Argentina. I don't really care that much. But Max Weber also noted that large institutional religions, you know, such as the religion of Egypt or the Catholic Church, generally tend to be, you know, have a symbiotic relationship with the ruling classes, and they kind of support each other. I want to skip that history there. So what then do we mean, or does Gramsci mean by hegemony, or what do I make of it? That hegemony is the ideological control of culture that serves to maintain the interests of what Gramsci called the historic bloc. That was his term for the ruling classes, because it wasn't simply the economic elites. It was also the political elites, it was the intellectual elites, the cultural elites, and the religious elites. It was not a single unit, and there's no conspiracy here. But the people who are at the top of these power hierarchies have a similar interest in maintaining their power, and sort of, maintaining the power of each is necessary to maintain the power of all the elites. And so there's a collusion, not a conspiracy, but a conclusion in how their interests go along with each other in order to sustain certain ruling class interests as normal, natural, and in the best interests of all. The dissent and critique of such views was considered bizarre, immature, pathological, and those people, that would include us, are easily marginalized. And we know that communists, socialists, anarchists, Marxists of any kind, and that would include people that can think, are just plain weird nutcases who would rather destroy the American way of life. In other words, hegemony makes the historically arbitrary seem normal, natural, and widely accepted, and that ruling class interest is cloaked. It is hidden behind these various kinds of discourses that I've talked about, and we'll say a few more things. Ruling class domination is not simply supported by the people, but in that support of the people wind up economically exploited, politically suppressed, politically coerced, culturally thwarted, and 100 years ago, sexually frustrated at the same time. And I don't mean this simply as a joke, because as Wilhelm Reich showed, coming off of Freud, for whom all civilization required repression, what Wilhelm Reich showed is that it was specifically capitalist civilization, not all civilization, that required sexual repression. So why would people spend their lives being horny in order to maintain a compliant, authoritarian personality that would follow the work demands of a capitalist society? Okay, so what I really want to get to here is that one of the main problems of most contemporary thinkers, including many thinkers on the left, is the embrace of reason. If we go back to Kant, and Kant is important, what was the Enlightenment? And Kant's words were, the Enlightenment was man's progress from his self-imposed immaturity and the value of reason over emotions, over superstitions, over nonsense. And it was the belief, I'll mention Kant, one could probably give 2 or 3 different years of discussion on the whole range of Enlightenment philosophers. But the most important point here is that the Enlightenment philosophers in general, believed that people were reasonable beings, and that by being presented with facts, evidence, and data, people could come to a logical, rational conclusion. And that has informed much of contemporary academic life. We see this in my field, sociology. There's the dominant view in social movements, which was something else I could have talked about, and I sort of did when I talked about the Tea Party. The dominant view in American social movements is called resource mobilization, that says people are rational actors acting in their self-interest. That's absolute bullshit. We see this in economics, the idea that people are rational actors that rationally pursue their self-interest, and we see this all the way from various, conservative, even many liberal economists accept this notion that people act in rational ways, which is why they elect people like, or would have elected people like Romney. Boy, that's really a rational conclusion. Okay, so what the major point that I want to talk about is how it's really emotions that are at the basis of our identities. Okay. One of the places where we see this, just to go backtrack for just a moment, is in religion, and how religion continues in the United States to play a very, very salient role. And it's declining. It's finally happening here. Too little, too late. But it's beginning to follow the European model. Okay. So ultimately, the larger questions are: what are the dominant forms of hegemony? And the reason I mention religion often is because historically religion has been the basic site in which, the basic source of hegemony. We can see this very clearly in medieval Europe, where the church, of course, blessed the kings because the kings were descendants of God's will. And in turn, the kings protected the church. Now, with the Enlightenment, there were, at least among a number of elites, some questions about the power of God, etc., etc. And what we see happening at that time is God begins to change her mind and switch his or her allegiances from the ruling monarchs, who are slowly but surely losing their heads, but to the rising bourgeoisie. And so we begin to see the rise of capitalism and democracy and all these kinds of things as the new forms of hegemony as religion began to wane. Now, with the rise of capitalism, on the one hand, there is some progress, and Marx himself said that one of the great blessings of capitalism is the end of, what did he say? The demise of the idiocy of rural life. Marx had not spent much time in contemporary America, because if anybody wants to see the persistence of the idiocy of rural life, listen to Republicans when they're talking on, C-SPAN or something like that. The idiocy of rural life is alive and well, and we call it the Republican Party. Not that the Democrats are much better, but that's besides the point. Anyhow, as religion began to wane and capitalism began to rise, there was what we Marxists call a dialectical consequence. And that consequence was large masses of exploited working class people living in the cities and around the factories that were growing. And before you know it, there was the danger of what might happen. And what might happen when you concentrate large numbers of, discontented workers, one worker on the assembly would basically say, "The boss is an asshole, pass it on." And before you know it, large numbers of people might gather together and revolt and listen to those, weirdo communists outside the factory gates and start putting together an agenda of social change and revolution. Well, never underestimate the bourgeoisie. They are smart. They are very smart people. And so slowly but surely, with the rise of industrialization, we begin to see another new hegemonic ideology taking place in the world, and this is the power of nationalism. Now, in a class society, we have a ruling class and a ruled class, proletarian and elite, a few others and all that. But in a nation, we have a community where all citizens are equal. Even if some citizens can send other citizens to their graves by order. But nationalism starts becoming one of the major forms of hegemonic ideology. Well, I've written a lot on nationalism, and I think it's a very important aspect of hegemony. Just look at our own country, of how many people supported the invasion of Vietnam, and you see where they got us. And you thought we would have learned something, and then we get Iraq. Nationalism, because it is founded on emotions, has a tendency to erupt and then wane after a while. So we needed something new toward the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, as capitalism was facing a number of crises. Capitalism, by definition, is crisis-prone. Perhaps the most important, the people who do economics might remember, not personally, none of us were alive at the Panic of '93, and that's 1893. But the capitalist system became very, very efficient, especially at the end of the 1800s with the invention of the electric motor, which completely transformed manufacturing just as much as the steam engine had transformed the production of textiles. And now we could get new kinds of mass production to create a new kind of goods. Those of us who know capital, dream about rolls of linen being turned into shirts and jackets all the time. But now we begin to see mass production of consumer items, slowly but surely followed by the growth of new forms of communication, namely radio, film, and eventually television. And so now we see that the dominant form of hegemonic ideology, or the dominant hegemonic ideology, becomes consumerism. That if you buy enough, you'll find the goods life. When the going gets tough, go shopping, etc., etc., which has you know, when you read the financial pages, as people like myself do, you know, it looks like consumerism is back. People are buying again. Housing prices are going up. Another 100 years, they'll be the same place as they were in 2007. But consumerism back because now people can go out and feel confident that the economy is going to stay where it is. They're going out and buying stuff. Okay, what I want to move to, though, is the real central issue, though, of my discussion, which is how and why these things are sustained. And these are the questions of identity. What I want to get to, and I don't know if I'm going to get there, but what I want to get to is, as I've already mentioned, what sustains people's beliefs is what things do for their wallet or what they do for their identity. So I can find. Hey, that's fine. Where's the pill that goes with it? Great. To understand identity the way I'm going to use it, we really want to go back to Freud. And for Freud, like other social contract theorists such as Locke or Hobbes, people have to give something up for the sake of civilization. Whereas for Hobbes and Locke, they gave up some of their freedom for the political state. For Freud, they gave up their sexual gratification. The important point here, though, for Freud, and this is for the people who know Freud's argument, especially in Civilization is Discontent, that people need to repress their sexual desires. Why? And I thought I had an answer, but I can't think of a good reason. Well, Freud had an answer. He was wrong, but he had an answer. One, so that people wouldn't quarrel over sexual partners. It maintained peace and tranquility so that people could work together without conflict and build civilization. That's number one. Number two, and this is part of the weakest theory of Freud, his theory of sublimation, but you know, we'll have to go along with it. Somehow, if you repress sexual desire, this is sort of the psychoanalytic version of the philosopher's stone that turns lead into gold. If you repress sexual desire, it will come out as art, as creativity, as things of beauty. Now, the only flaw in that is if anybody knows much about the history of art, many of the greatest artists were not among the most repressed. Has anybody besides me been to the Picasso show yet? You know, you could look at Picasso's life from his teenage sexual fantasies that he actually put down on, it was a paper and charcoal rather than oil. He couldn't do it when he was 13 years old. But already as a teenager, those people who know art history, that Picasso was, you know, painting pictures of what we sometimes call cunnilingus fellatio, more commonly known as giving and receiving head. Okay, and then if we look at Picasso's life, he seems to constantly be going from one lover to another. What did he have, 4 wives, was it? And how many partners and muses?
100 maybe?
Okay, another example of repression would, of course, be Gauguin. All right, I don't have to belabor the obvious, but the notion in Freud is that the repression of sexuality enables people to work together to build civilization and gives us that sexual energy to express in various forms of creativity. Okay, now he was wrong. But what became important for Freud is the basis of that repression was the internalization of cultural values in the superego. In the ego as well, but I don't want to go too far into the psychoanalytic. I want to try to finish in 10 minutes so you can fight with me. The basis of the superego in classical Freudian thought, and for the people that don't know it, there's no classical Freudians left. I mean, the theory has been completely, not demolished, but I mean the important parts of unconscious repression are still with us, but a lot of the stuff about the Oedipus complex is very historical. Important point here is that the superego, and I know that the women are going to be offended because Freud didn't even think the women had superegos, but that's a whole different discussion, that the basis of the superego is that little boys get turned on by their moms, but they're afraid that their daddy is going to cut off their balls, called castration anxiety. I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. And so in order to defend themselves against daddy's knife and daddy's aggression, they identify with their father. There's a mechanism called identification with the aggressor. And so it's sort of that notion that, you know, now I'm on your side, you can't hit me. And those of you who appreciate fine culture like Picasso also should appreciate the Three Stooges. And it's sort of like one of those episodes where Curly says, you know, Curly goes up to Moe and, you know, draws a line in the sand, crosses the line, and Curly says to Moe, now I'm on your side and you can't hit me. At which time Moe, of course, pokes out Curly's eyes. Okay, the point here is that the superego develops as a defense against aggression. And what's the reason we don't want aggression? Because all aggression ultimately leads to annihilation and death. And this is probably one of the most profound motives in human beings. I'm going to come to this a little later. I think the other thing that we should note here, also tied to the internalization of values, goes back a little bit earlier, and that's the development of the ego. And in classical Freudian theory, the ego develops because of the fear of abandonment. This is of much younger children. For those that are steeped in the Freudian tradition, Freud's words were that identification is the precipitate of abandoned cathexis. Translated into English, that means that because we're afraid of being abandoned, we identify with our caretakers. Okay, what I want to try to suggest here is that Freudian theory, even in its more silly forms that it began with, still has important insights to show us that the development of the character and self that ultimately become part and parcel of identity, or identity becomes tied in with them, begins in terms of defenses. Defenses against abandonment, defenses against annihilation. And on the basis of these fears, identity is what enables us to live and function and work in the world. What I'd like to suggest, and this is my own little paradigm, is that we can, beginning with Freudian theory, move to a notion of what I might want to call 4 moments or 4 desires or something like this. This is not a personality theory. This is not, you know, go along in the textbook of theories of personality, Freudian theories, behavioral theories, etc. But I want to suggest that there are 4 important motives, desires, or qualities of human beings that I think are important for us to understand identity in terms of hegemony. Number 1 is going to be attachment. Human beings need attachments. This has been so long established that it's almost ridiculous to even mention this, that little infants need an attachment to a mother to survive, just to thrive. Without that, we see all kinds of pathology, quite often death. That the desire for friendship, for warmth, for, you know, I don't know about marriage, but, you know, it's absolutely, people need people. This is not my original observation. Aristotle said this 2,500 years ago, that people were political, social creatures. And I mean, this is something that is so easily acceptable, except by various people. The postmodernists no longer have any need for people, as long as they have some texts to deconstruct. They don't really need people. But any other position, the need for relationships with people is essential. Our identities are based on our attachments to people, and we get them from people. People have a sense of agency. Those who remember the 1844 manuscripts, what was Marx's critique of alienation? That when people sold their labor as a commodity and produced commodities for the market, they created a market that, in Marx's words, stood outside them and acted as an alien force that refluxed back upon them. In other words, the worker produced his or her powerlessness through the sale of his labor. Now, why does this matter? Because people aren't turtles. People do need to have some kind of sense of creative fulfillment. And I know that thank God the postmodernists don't come to places like this. But you call it essentialist, but people need to have some impact on the world, some sense of creative fulfillment. You know, for Marx, you know, the ultimate goal of the annihilation of socialism, and Peter might talk about this later, is so that people can write poetry, can enjoy literature, and spend the evening writing philosophy or sociology papers. This is where creativity can really be found. People are agents, they need a sense of creative fulfillment. People need recognition. Long before psychoanalytic theory emerged, this was absolutely essential for Hegel's phenomenology. with a bunch of philosophers here. I'm not going to try to do too much on Hegel's philosophy, but simply say that for Hegel, in the act of work, as man, that's the way Hegel put it, as humans transform nature, and we're aware of the differentiation of self and the natural element, a fragile sense of self-consciousness emerged. And it was that sense of self-consciousness that enabled the bondsman, that's the slave, to develop a certain sense of self-consciousness that his master, Hegel's a chauvinist pig like the rest of them, but that his master required that recognition of his superiority in order to have his own self-consciousness. If this is getting a little bit too philosophical, I can just drop it and just say that people need a certain sense of recognition, and they'll do all kinds of things from, act like fools, talk at the Open University. People need to be recognized as human beings. People were not pack animals. They were not donkeys who can walk around pulling, a stone all day long, pumping water, etc. Finally, what I want to conclude is I want to try to conclude in 5 minutes. People need a sense of meaning. Unless you're a philosopher or a sociologist, most people need to have some kind of notion that their lives are significant, that their lives are meaningful, and can't be comfortable knowing that they have no more meaning in the universe than a drop of water in an ocean or a grain of sand on the beach. Now, one of the reasons that meaning is so important is because of the fear of meaninglessness, and ultimately this rests on the fear of our own insignificance that is seen in death. I don't want to do a lot of references, I've already made several to Marx, but I want to mention something that most people probably aren't familiar with, and this is a book called The Denial of Death by Ernst Becker. Does anybody know that book by any chance? Isn't it one of the greatest books you've ever read? Utterly fantastic book. And what he argues is that both the development of the individual character and the building of social institutions, building of frameworks of meaning, is a way of temporarily combating that insignificance that we might find in an otherwise meaningless world that terminates with death. So we need to have some kind of purpose for our lives. Okay, now, to bring these things together and then finally come to, oh God, I got more here than I planned on, to try to come to some kind of a conclusion, is that why do we first gain an individual identity? In order to deal with our connections to people, to ultimately give us a sense of recognition, to provide us with realms of agency, and tie us to frameworks of meaning. So these various hegemonic beliefs, values, and understandings of the world become part of our own sense of self and provide us with these gratifications. Moreover, that which confronts our sense, that which challenges our sense of self, evokes denial to preserve our sense of self, perhaps anger at any individual or group that would challenge our identities, and last but not least, our identity enables us to project undesirable aspects of ourselves to other people. So if you follow what I'm saying, we have a variety of hegemonic beliefs, beginning with religion, going through nationalism, ending with consumerism of the day, a bunch of others. That these hegemonic beliefs are not just a bunch of cultural frameworks that are out there, but they become part and parcel of ourselves through the normal channels of socialization. And for Gramsci, these are, of course, that we begin in the family and then the school, and the schools are among the most lethal, dangerous institutions of hegemonic transmission because they don't allow for a plurality of view. The media, etc., all equally, maybe not equally, but contribute more or less to the internalization of dominant ideologies, and as I said before, in terms of what is normal, natural, and best for everybody. Okay. I'm going to show some examples, some of which have already been noted. This morning on Alternet, great website if anybody looks at it, this morning on Alternet, some people probably seeking tenure did a study of how the rich, and this is the very, very rich, were different from the rest of us, as if we didn't know. I think it was, let's see Wasn't it Fitzgerald?
Yes. Yes.
But I think we've known that for a long time. And what they did was on a number of political values, that the rich were much less supportive of the distribution of wealth, especially when that distribution of wealth meant an increase in their own taxes. That the rich see deficits as a far more serious problem than unemployment. And of course, the primary site of deficit reduction are social benefits rather than military costs or, perish thought, raising taxes and incomes on incomes that are already 10 to 12 times the level of obscene income. I mean, how do you go about spending $4 billion a year? I couldn't possibly spend more than $1 billion myself. I don't know what I would even do, and I'd give most of it to charities and create a magnificent open university of the left that would be a city on the hill that would shine to all. Okay, but the important point is really not that the rich think differently than we do, but going back to the very first point that Eric mentioned, these are the discourses that are part of our national discussion. These are for those people that waste their Sunday mornings watching the talking heads, which are mostly rich, white, male talking heads. These are, the question is ultimately just how much should we reduce the deficit? There are a few fairly decent talking heads like Kuzma that say, you know, the deficit reduction is not as important as these rich assholes make it out to be. But the point is that this doesn't generate any kind of popular, you know, I guess economic policy has really never been the issue of mass movements. Maybe it should be. But why is it people believe that kind of stuff? In other words, the point that the rich make, their values, are the ones that are generally discussed. A couple of others. I mentioned earlier climate change. How can anybody in this day and age, and David knows just as well as I do, there are intelligent people, well-meaning, no, I don't know if they're well-meaning. There are intelligent people who basically claim, David, do I get this right, that climate change is the biggest hoax that repressive governments are fostering and pushing upon the people. Is that the way it was?
That's right.
Okay. Support for the military. The greatest piece of boondoggle in all history, the greatest amount of money shoved down a toilet can be summarized in one letter and two numbers, F-35. A piece of shit supersonic stealth plane that nobody will fly because it's dangerous to fly. It's a $400 billion, it's the most expensive weapon program in history, and it doesn't work, and it never will work. And even if it did work, who would it be working against? That no other country in the world would piss their money away on a supersonic stealth fighter, especially when for the price of one F-35 you can have 100 drones that'll get past all those defenses in order to kill just as many, if not more, women and children. So, but these military programs keep going on and on and on. For those who don't like military expenses any more than I do, you could look at the Hercules 130, another piece of another piece of flying shit. But we don't get any kind of protest against it. Why? Because this is defending peace, freedom, justice, and the American way.
Right.
And it is very, very difficult to challenge these kinds of hegemonic beliefs. Okay, so what I want to do to try to finish this off, I had some extra pieces here, so I am just about finished, is I want to talk about some recent work that kind of brings a lot of these themes together. Gramsci's notions of hegemony with concerns of identity. I would, of course, reiterate, as I started before, the classical studies of the Frankfurt School, the studies on authoritarianism, that began with the studies of the German workers. This was a huge study that began when Erich Fromm introduced the Frankfurt School to Freudian theory, and they interviewed thousands and thousands of workers. For the sake of time, I'll be very brief. I just want to mention one little anecdote that took place when I myself was in graduate school. Something that never came out, but the real brief part of the story is when the Frankfurt scholars began to see the depth of the hatred, the nihilism, the destructive impulses behind the facades of the German people. They knew where to go. And they knew they had to get out of Germany, whereas so many of the German Jews said, "Ah, this will pass, you know, we fought bravely in World War I, you know, Hitler will pass, and all this anti-Semitism, you know, it'll just go away." But in the study of authoritarianism, they began to see the kind of what's called authoritarian aggression, this nihilistic, irrational kinds of hatred. There are a number of other aspects of the authoritarian personality, the tendency to dominate subordinates, to subordinate oneself to a superior authority. Ultimately, that authority might be God. An intolerance of ambiguity, a lack of open-mindedness, a tendency to project aggression, stereotypy, etc., etc. But more recent, what I want to just briefly mention are some of the more recent work, and here I want to talk about the work of George Lakoff, who is a cognitive psychologist, a neuropsychologist that knows less about the Frankfurt School than he probably knows about the other side of the moon. He has no connection with that kind of tradition. But he has developed a very, very interesting framework in which he has developed, you know, written a number of books on framing and things like that. And what he suggested is, as a result of our families, I would say beyond our families, but there are two basic family orientations that shape our basic character structure. What he calls the strict father versus the nurturing parent. The strict father emphasizes self-reliance, individualism, self-control, especially control of sexual desires, and independence and a readiness to use aggression when necessary, especially aggression to punish evildoers. The other view is what's called the nurturing parent, people who place more emphasis on empathy, care, and concern with others. Well, what he likes to suggest is that these two orientations become reflected in our politics. And since they're established in early years for Lakoff, they may change later, but for Lakoff, subsequent change that takes place much later, or subsequent events, don't take place. So what Lakoff offers is a way of understanding why so many people will accept, you know, conservative views of government. I think the one that I like the most is why pro-lifers are so strongly, you know, defend the life of the unborn, but once that unborn is born, will not spend a penny on his or her health care, and lest he or she commit a capital crime, pro-life only extends to the moment of birth. After that, you know, send him to prison, which is a living death, or whatever. What I'd like to finish off on is just mentioning very quickly here the work of Chris Mooney, who's a journalist, not an academic. And he's written two absolutely wonderful books. One is called The Republican War on Science. And he raises the question as to why people, no matter what evidence they're shown, double down and reject it. Social psychological study has shown for a long time, you know, you select people on the basis of a particular value, you know, death penalty or whatever, and you present them with contrary evidence. So, for example, most of us sociologists know that the death penalty not only is not impartially administered, but it doesn't work. It does not reduce death. It does not reduce homicide. It's basically a waste of money. Why do people believe in it? So you present people with study after study showing that it's a waste of time, money, and human life. And what do? Do they rethink their position? No. They double down and more actively reject the evidence that is contrary. Some people will accept evidence. I think I may not be the only person here who's an ex-smoker. Is there any other ex-smokers around? Oh yeah, oh yeah. So, you know, once I became totally convinced that smoking caused cancer, actually in my case it was when my daughter was born, and I figured I have every right to destroy myself, and I think I have. But I don't have the right to inflict that on anyone else, and so when my daughter came home from the hospital, I stopped smoking. I haven't had a nicotine cigarette. That was a careful choice of words. I haven't had a nicotine cigarette yet. And I think that basically the most important concept that I want to get out of Mooney that ties identity and hegemony together is the concept that he calls motivated reasoning. What is motivated reasoning? Motivated reasoning is the ability, and this is based on our identity, as I said, to accept those facts and evidence that sustain our position and build a barrier, a wall against that which we disagree with, including, and this is what makes it motivated, that if there's something that we agree We will find an expert to sustain our position. We don't believe in evolution. Okay. Within the tens and thousands, if not over 100,000 biologists, anthropologists, and paleontologists in the world, surely there are two creationists who are now making a fortune going to creationist parties and telling them that the world is 6,000 years old and that once upon a time Adam and Eve rode around paradise on saddles on dinosaurs. There is a museum that attests to this. Now many of you may raise the question, well, weren't dinosaurs carnivores? No, not all of them were. But dinosaurs didn't become carnivores until original sin.
Fall.
You laugh! There are people that believe this. And we can go on and on. My favorite is the question of how could Noah get two of every animal on board the ark, especially when we're talking about dinosaurs and some of those things, you know, if you saw Big Sue down at the museum, at the field, he just took the eggs after the ark landed. Okay, anyhow, people will believe this. And, you know, we can joke about this because some of us actually do believe in science, but there are people who really believe this bullshit. Okay, after all of this, I think the last example that I want to mention here, and I can't prove it one way or the other, was Francis I involved in the dirty war in Argentina? What a surprise, the Vatican says no. But some people suggested that he actually kept a few people in his house and turned them over to the military. I have absolutely no idea. I really can't guess. I think that that's not relevant. We know that unlike Ratzinger, he wasn't actually a member of the Hitlerjugend. So, what? You know, so, you know, the big question here is, do you really have to be an official Nazi to be a Nazi? But that's a different question. The final point, what I want to come to bring this all to a close, is going back to Gramsci's problem of trying to organize people for the Communist Party. What does any of this have to do with any kind of practical politics? Well, what I want to try to suggest is this, and many people kind of know this already, that to fight a war of position is not simply bringing facts and evidence to people, but also understanding the issues of identity. And the first thing one would have to accept to understand the identity is that at a certain point in life, and that's usually when people begin working and incorporate it into a work group, at that point, the ability to bring facts to an argument ends. And that you can no more argue and debate with some people than you can with a stone or a shoe or a doorknob. So don't waste your time trying to convince the Republican side of your family that the Republican policies not only have not worked, but never will work. That the harder you push austerity, the more people you put out of work, and the further down your economy grows. Let me just use one word as evidence. Has anybody ever heard of a place called Greece? Okay. And so we see that if we reduce Greece back to the standards of living that were prevalent when Plato and Aristotle were teaching, we still might find some more places to cut. You know, we don't have to keep those temples washed and all of that kind of stuff. So the main conclusion I want to get to is that there is one point, I would argue, sort of unlike Lakoff, but the one point that I think is important is to be able to reach people at those points where identity is being formed but is not yet cemented, you know, cemented into place, wrapped in platinum, then kryptonite, and then, in honor of our new Dreamliner, you know, carbon fiber. And this is the important role that education still has to play. And as we've noted, education is being cut almost everywhere. That young people today, in large part as a response to the economic contradictions of contemporary capitalism, they know they're not going to find jobs, and if they do find jobs, they're never going to make enough to pay their college loans. And so what they may wind up doing, I warn you people who have young kids, they may wind up moving back into your house. Move if you can, don't leave them for etc. And so I think that this is that one of the places that I think is really important is, given the crises that we're facing and young people are facing, more and more young people are becoming receptive to open ideas. And we see this to a certain extent with the decline of racism, the decline of sexism, the decline of homophobia, and the openness toward government programs. And even among some surveys, I think the Pew survey shows that 30% of young people are as supportive of socialism. They don't know what it is, but they're as supportive of socialism as they are of capitalism. And so I don't want to end on a pessimistic note of saying that hegemony is all hegemonic, because that's not what Gramsci believed. That for Gramsci, it was possible and desirable to offer counter-hegemonic discourses. I would fully agree, but let's make sure that we devote our energies toward the right targets, and that's young people who haven't had their minds turned to shit. Thank you. I don't have time for questions, I got you.
Okay, listen, we have about 35 minutes and we've got a good size audience here today. So let's try to limit our comments or our questions to a couple of minutes, okay? Save that, you know, that elongated discourse for your next book or something, all right?
Hi, thank you, Doctor. For once, I have a question, and it's short. And you'll forgive my reductionism. I want to ask a little more toward the, less toward the Gramscian and more toward the sociological and psychological part of your talk. Again, forgive my reductionism, but could you elaborate, or are you saying anything more than people choose the worldview that makes them most comfortable? Because it seems to me that, from what you said and from my own experience, that these what we would consider rather way out worldviews make people extremely comfortable.
You asked me a short question, I'm giving you a short answer. Kind of, yeah. And I think that all I've really done is kind of explain why certain worldviews give people a sense of security, maintain their dignity. Now, I happen to think that it's shit when a person's dignity is based on his being superior to a woman. A white guy has a sense of comfort and dignity because he's not black, because he's straight. Yeah, I mean...
I don't want you to answer this, but that leads me to ask, what's my problem?
You know, I mean, the point here is that these discussions don't become part of many of the discussions on the left, and I've been around the left for a long time, that to even bring a psychological moment in makes you a bourgeois liberal.
Or worse.
Or what's worse than that?
Bourgeois reactionary.
Just a few points. First of all, you know, like you might answer, well, what's this stupid waste of money in the military? One is there's a lot of literature to support the idea that that's the anchor of our economy and has been since about 1938. And two, that it's also the anchor of a lot of identity. We're number one, we killed. Okay, so that's two good reasons. Two, you said finance or economics are rarely part of popular resistance or popular struggle. The one salient counterexample, of course, was the populists and the Cross of Gold. And we see how where that went. There's a lot of discussion about how important that period was and how it locked in our current party system. And then one question, which you couldn't answer or not, is what stereopody?
What is what?
Stereopody, you mentioned, I didn't know what it was.
Stereotyping.
Okay, there you go. And then finally, I don't know how to think about, or to actually not even answer very well, a question that I came up against when I was trying to organize. This is back in the 70s. A lot of workers would say to me, all right, you know what, you're probably right. What the hell can we do about it? We don't have any means to overthrow these pigs. We might as well get what we can.
You know, I'm sort of not sure which to answer. I think I carefully stated, I hope I did because it was in my notes, that identity is not simply, you know, people will embrace an identity, if, you know, embrace positions if it fits their identity or their wallet. And so the defense contractor is very smart. They have their, everything gets subcontracted to every state so that there's an economic incentive for our good liberals, shitheads, to wind up vote. How often do liberals ever vote a major military program out of existence?
Or coal gasification.
So, you know what I mean? This is why I am a Marxist and not a liberal, because the liberals, the smiling face of capital, as opposed to the grumbling, the stern faces of Romney, so I'll take Obama's smile, although I didn't vote for him. The point here is that I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not sure on the specific things. I think, though, the final point you made is really important. That part and parcel of the hegemonic ideologies is the notion that we can't do anything about it. And we see this notion that when it looks like something can be done, those motherfuckers will bring every amount of force in. If you go back to Marx, in the 18th Brumaire, Marx describes how the proletariat, no one came to their side. No one. They were devastated. We move up to the 1871, the Paris Commune. What happens to the Paris Commune? Blood in the streets. Let's go more recently to the Occupy movements here, that I don't think were as effective as they should have been and could have been, but they were basically relatively harmless, but they challenged the ruling class hegemony. They began to talk about inequality. They began to talk about the banks that we know are too big to fail and the bankers too big to jail. And they had to be ruthlessly suppressed, not just broken up, but we saw that, we saw how they were broken up. This is what happens when people do try, and the fact that people can. And I think that the notion that we're powerless, we can't do anything about it, this is part of hegemony, and this is exactly what counter-hegemonic, organic intellectuals need to overcome. I don't have the answer. If I had the answer, I'd be out organizing now. Maybe not, it's kind of cold outside. Jim.
Hi. Thank you very much for a very good, fun lecture. And you mentioned, and you talked a lot about, conservative people that don't believe in science and just have very weird ideas and are irrational and all of that. I would like if you could comment on more liberal people who believe in science, know about ecology, know about the evils of war, but support a president like ours who's a war criminal and just go along with the system where all of those things that they know about are getting ruined.
What can I say? I mean, it's not easy to put yourself, as Gramsci pointed out, or other students of hegemony, that to question the ruling class ideologies. And don't kid yourself, the liberals, the Democrats, are as much a part of the ruling class as the conservatives, in fact, in some ways more so. It's very difficult to put yourself in the oddball position of those who would question the status quo. And so, but the point is, though, that many people, not all, but many people do various kinds of things. So for example, if you're on the left, and this was a big debate, not a killer debate, but among the left, as to whether or not you vote for Obama. Now, I published an article in Logos Online in the fall edition on Obama and why I said there that Obama was still better than Romney, but I didn't vote for him for the same reason, that a constitutional lawyer makes himself judge, jury, and executioner, continues Guantanamo, I don't know if it's true now, but is willing to bargain away some of the Social Security and Medicare benefits. Yeah, but it is easier to go along, and that's ultimately part and parcel of hegemony that most people... Look, all of social change, and now I can move over to my social movement stuff. Social change does not come about when vast majorities of people make a change. Social movements come about when small, dedicated minorities are able to bring change about. I work, as many people know, at a Catholic university. I know that we may not find too many religious Jesuits in our audience today, but if we look back historically, Jesus and about a dozen cronies were able to change the nature of Western religion. If we look at the rise of capitalism, at first the capitalists were not popular. Civil rights, gay rights, that these changes come about because small, dedicated minorities feeling, strains, organize, mobilize, and put on political pressure. As long as people feel, well, we can't do anything about it, but the goddamn truth is, we can do something about it. We have done things about it, but right now it's especially difficult. But look, as we're talking, the young folks in Greece, they're out there on the streets. 2 years ago in Israel, we saw the largest demonstration on a per capita basis of human history. 10% of the Israelis, now of course they didn't have an ideology, they were just protesting, but what wound up happening in Israeli politics is that Lapid wound up coming in second, a nobody from out of nowhere, that really thwarted and dampened the power of Netanyahu, such that Lapid is now the finance minister. Now, does that mean that peace with the Arab world and the Muslim, and the Palestinians around the corner? No. But the fact is that if people do organize, and I think what we need is more organization that's successful to convince people that they can do something.
How much time is there?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so I guess I'll just ask one question. The fringe battle of politics is really is losing. People who don't get their voices heard, for the most part, in terms of the left in the mainstream media, and people who, just in general conversation, it's turning more towards the far right and the libertarian right. And specifically when conversations about Obama come up, it's very easy for me to criticize Obama to a bunch of liberals. But it's hard for me to criticize them to a bunch of people who, at the same time that I'm criticizing Obama, say that we should completely do away with the entire federal government, and we shouldn't make the military a privatized situation as well as the police force. How can a conversation like that actually be orchestrated so that when I say yes, he's a shithead, and in the same breath be able to support the possibility of there being a leftist situation in this country?
That's a tough question, but let me try to answer it very quickly as best I can. First of all, I'm a little bit more optimistic because as I look at surveys, that's one of the things we sociologists do. We look at a lot of studies and research agendas and things like that. There's a lot more hope in the young people than there are in us old farts. I really want to tell you that. And on a lot of the social issues, that it was clear in the last election, part and parcel of Obama's winning is that he got the majority of people under 45 and Romney got the majority of people over 45. What you have to do is live long enough to let all those older folks croak. And that will happen. Unfortunately, some of those good ones will be there too. But the point here is that there are major progressive changes taking place in lifestyle and value. I think part of my answer would be, don't waste your time trying to convince a libertarian that we need government support. You can show them all the evidence, as I suggested. Show them that, you can't, the example David used the other day. You can't have a Jobs or Gates unless the government had invested in the internet and basically gave the internet to private industry. You would not have a major computer industry. Much of the development of the computer industry was developed in World War II. Part of it was the code-breaking attempt, and we ultimately succeeded, or the English broke the ultra code of the German. So there's nothing you can tell these people. Don't waste your time. What you can do, though, is get some of the people your age. I mean, you might be the youngest person here. Get some of the people your age to come to groups like this, and at least if they're open. Remember, I said part of authoritarianism is openness to experience. If they're open, they will begin to question these things and raise these questions, and more people are. And that's why I'm a little bit more optimistic.
Can you imagine how entertaining and uninhibited Lauren is in a non-academic social forum? Start with religion, of course. That's right. Yes, and the collusion is very clear too. I just found out that, I mean, how much bullshit can we take with the Vatican anymore? The Pope is making 200 million a year. And that is in addition to all his travel and living expenses. But how does religion do it is with two factors that I find are in operation. One is the fear that you mentioned about the next place, and the other one is the fix. The dependency, and especially identity, dependency of the identity is created by religion, first, by telling you that you are nothing original sin, you are a sinner, you can't handle life without God. And then fulfilling and relieving these dependencies by swallowing and mashing you. So that's how religion has been replicating all these years. Another factor that I'm surprised that you didn't mention is PR, which is basically capitalism and the control of the subconscious. You talked about Freud, but Edward Bernays, his nephew, that learned how to really, in a very subtle way, control the mind of everybody who watches the media, and we know who controls the media, which is the ruling class, and you got it made. And all you need to do, let's say in a commercial on TV, is create a myth that something is the norm, that a certain brand of jeans or shoes are the one that will get you in. And that's all, even if they didn't sell one pair yet. So, and how this is done is and that's one thing that I wish you would mention, is that social learning, all our social learning is done by copying. You know, your friend kind of poo-pooed me when I said we are all apes, but we are apes. That's how we learn, is by mimicking each other, and this is how culture is formed. So we are always in a situation when we have to copy. And we have to be careful, I'm talking too much, but we have to be careful also with the left. I think it was Bruno Rizzi who talked about the bureaucratization of the collectiveness, is that what he called it? That it can happen to the left too. What we need to do is be aware of our attachment to our identity and the attachment to those norms that create our identity, whether it's right or left. Of course, I believe the left has more to say, but that's...
Given the fact that there's a lot of people, let me just give you one answer. When I talked about consumerism, I'm really talking about the entire thing. And I don't know if you may know it, but if other people don't. Google Century of the Self. It's a 4-part series that the BBC did on the influence of Bernays, and it's really fascinating because it picks up on a lot of what Bernays was saying to bring us to things such as why Americans during the Second Gulf War were more likely to buy SUVs because the fear of being kidnapped. And it's true, not one single American driving an SUV in the streets of New York or Chicago was kidnapped by Al-Qaeda, while these horrible monsters were rolling down the street weighing 75 tons, 85 if you include the weapons mounted on them, etc., etc. But no, you're right. I think that there's other ways that we learn, because not just copying, but some of us have the ability to think and develop new kinds of insights, or bring things together, as I, for better or for worse, more worse than better, would bring together the Gramscian discourses on hegemony with the more psychoanalytically informed, not entirely psychoanalytic, on identity, because I think that the point that I make, I'm surprised other people haven't made it, some people have here and there, of the extent to which domination is maintained, this is what Freud said, not simply because of the people that control force, but because it becomes internalized within us. I mean, there's a whole history of people that have said that, but let's try to take some of these others in the last 90 seconds.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting.
Thank you.
Since you were talking about why, why people would vote against their own interests, I was wondering if you've read the book "What's the Matter with Kansas" by Tom Frank, and if so, I mean, what's your take on Tom Frank? Because he talks about the same thing, and I was wondering what do you think about his analysis of that?
Wonderful. I think it's a little, I mean, yeah, I think it's a very, very good analysis. But if you like that kind of stuff, let me recommend one that's even much better. Deer Hunting with Jesus.
What was that? Deer Hunting?
Deer Hunting with Jesus.
Yeah,
it's excellent.
It's an excellent, excellent book. It gives you much more of a flavor of why the oppressed working classes, and he's talking about somewhere in the South, out not far from Washington, D.C., why these oppressed working class guys are all, it's mostly guys, are all rock-solid Republicans and love their guns. Yeah. And he does have a very good take on their guns, which is a little bit different from the discussion now. But this is what happens when people are oppressed. They will identify with their oppressors. And they don't have the opportunity. Bagent himself says he got out of that life because he got an education. And that's why granted this is self-serving and hegemonic on my part, to believe that education helps people see the world, because like a lot of other people here, I didn't know shit from Shiloh until I went to college.
But one of the points that Tom Frank makes is that the people who go out and vote Republican are doing so because they are in rebellion, as in their own eyes, against the ruling class, which they see as a liberal elite.
Well, they're part of the ruling class, yeah. They see the ruling class as Democrats holding Chablis, looking down their noses at them, and they were going to get even with them. And so they oppose abortion, and they get school closings. They oppose contraception, and they get plant closings. Great bargain. But I mean, I think that's a very good empirical study of what I'm trying to say. I have no question what he did. There's places where we can debate it, but I think that basically it's a very good study. I haven't gotten to pity the poor billionaires yet.
Thanks for your talk. I was wondering if you could touch on this, I don't know, seemingly new or rise since Carter of this dispensationalism that's rise, this sort of eschatological determinism between end times, and how much that's really influencing our foreign policy now, as well as a lot of this right movement in Western Europe.
That's a tough one because I'm not a political scientist, but I think that we can easily over-exaggerate it. But I think that you raise a very interesting point about the end of times movement. And here, I want to be very, very clear that I'm citing the work of a colleague of mine, not my own work. She did a beautiful, beautiful study looking at end of time websites. A very eminent sociologist. Every sociologist knows she is Arlie Hochschild. And she basically, what she said is that for these people that tend to be sort of lower middle class suburbanite types, their social mobility has been blocked. Why? For all the reasons we know in terms of what's happened to the political economy of at least American capitalism in the last 40 years. But they've done everything right. They went to college. These are not uneducated people, even if they went to, religious type colleges. Not like Loyola that harbors mostly atheists. But anyhow. But what winds up happening is the end of times notion is, she says she sees all these people, they form into two groups. One seems to rise to heaven wearing their Sunday best. The other rise to heaven bare-ass naked. It doesn't matter what they're wearing, both groups are going to get to heaven. This becomes the alternative form of upward mobility, and how much higher up do you get than heaven? And so much of this end of times is basically saying this world sucks. But there's a better world up there, which is part of Christian theology for a long time, and that it's the blockage in mobility. Now, as I said about the Tea Party, and I said it here years ago, I said it in, oh, this is commercial, the July, I think, issue last summer of Critical Sociology. I have a volume in there on the Tea Party, and then it also includes Paul Street and Tony DiMaggio, some of the people that also come here and also talked about the Tea Party. They're in decline, they're in demise. I said it then and I'll say it again, buyer's remorse. They may look great marching around in Revolutionary War outfits to say, as they're coughing blood up saying we don't want no health care, we don't want no government, we don't want no education, even though half of them are getting health care. Although, obviously, and I don't want to insult Jim, but some of the drugs they're using for their psychosis don't help. But the point here is that this is on its way out. This is passing. The Republican Party are dead men walking. They will not survive because they will not recruit the young people. The young people do not go for this bullshit. You know, homophobia just doesn't get you the way it used to anymore. Racism, if you're under 30, racism is out. And if you don't have, you know, an Asian and an African American friend, you're out of touch. And so I think I want, you know, I mean, one of the things I think there's a whole other discussion. Get somebody else to do it. To be a leftist, you have to be optimist. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. You get much more fun in, you know, a casino or watching television. David.
Okay, Lauren, great talk. About the question of the young people. Because as you know, last Tuesday I debated the president and executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute, you know, Loyola. Was invited by a new group on campus, the Student Objectivist Society. So there's now an Ayn Rand group on campus. And also just this latest issue of Harper's has a long article about the Youth for Ron Paul. And how you get 6,000 of them showing up, you know, in a dome in Florida and so on and so forth, you know. And I guess, you know, I'm wondering about the appeal here, you know, on the issue of religion, for example, at Loyola. You know, I have a lot of young Jesuits, not a lot because there aren't a lot, but these are some of the most progressive, you know, people that I know that are really committed to go out there and change the world, you know, whereas the Ayn Randians are atheists, okay, and the Ryan Paul people, they're not interested, you know, in religion, you know. But so my question kind of is, what is the appeal to young people, you know, of this libertarian, and the Ayn Rand and the Ron Paul are on different camps, because Ron Paul is, you know, against militarism, against expanding the military, whereas the Ayn Rand, as we found out at the debate, you know, smash, you know, Fallujah to dust.
That wasn't Ayn Rand. That was him, not Ayn Rand.
That was him, but he's claiming it's based on objectivist moral principles and so on and so forth. So I don't know, what's the appeal to young people, and what identity is being formed here by this kind of crazy stuff that doesn't, you know, doesn't stand up to the facts. You point about the facts. This, you know, Ayn Rand guy is saying, no, 1998 was the warmest year, you know, in history. You know, go to the NASA website and it says 8 of the last 9 warmest years in the last 132 years was since 2000. You know,
and all set records.
I mean, it's just incredible. You know, and this is objectivism. We're interested in facts. You know, none of this liberal, squeamish, emotional nonsense or something. I don't know. Do you have any take on that?
Well, here's the problem. Sociologists like me look at data. And I really can't give you a real answer because I honestly don't know. I'll just give you off the seat of my pants or top of my head, which may not be that far apart, answer. That as the economy tightens, given the things that we've talked about in terms of childhood backgrounds, educational experience, and things like that, that my gut sense, because those people there, and you like my description, these are very much like pod people, alien replicants from another planet, that they seem to be from the business school, because I don't see people like this around, you know, around our campus. But my guess is that for some people, given their kind of upbringing, and I wouldn't be terribly surprised if a large number of them had fathers, mothers, both in the business world, that what's going on is the pie is shrinking.
Yeah.
And in the United States, the pie is, well, I don't know if the pie is shrinking, because so much of that pie is going to the top 1%, especially the top 1% of the 1%, which is the 400 godzillionaires of the world, of the United States. But I think that what's motivating them is, given the more difficult economic times, I want mine, and mine, and mine, and fuck anyone else. Right. And I will aggressively defend that position of my claims because I worked harder, and you bums, you 47% of the society that are moochers, takers, and parasites that want the government to feed them, want the government to clothe them and house them. And I have to say, you know, long before I became, you know, a full-fledged Marxist, and I'm not sure what it takes to become a full-fledged Marxist because critical theorists are always a little bit on the edge, You know, when I went to college, and it's a good thing there's not too many young people here because they'll feel very depressed. When I went to graduate school, I had a fellowship that covered my tuition and living expenses. And my standards of living have always been very high. And so I didn't have any problem about accepting money from the government. I probably got about $10,000, you know, over the 4 years that I was in graduate school, or graduate school being paid for. And I don't think that that's a problem, because I look at the income taxes that I pay, and every, you know, in the middle, at the last day that, you know, because I always get them done with 10 to 15 hours before they're due. You know, when I tell my wife what we owe, she says, well, you know, maybe we should have voted for Romney or something like that. You know, because, you know, now at our stage, you know, 2 full professors, you know, we're making way over minimum wages and things like that. I don't have any problem about government supporting people, because government supporting people is not only good for the people, but it's good for the society, and I don't have to tell you that. I don't have to tell you that because of your work. The thing that I think motivates these people is they're scared shitless that when they get their first jobs in the corporations, they're going to be consultants. They're not going to have full-time career tracks. And even if they're tough and nasty, there are possibilities for more. Look at what's happened to the law profession. You know that our school, Loyola, is now giving, you know, law students, they don't have to start repaying their outrageous loans until they get jobs. And there's no question whatsoever that 1% of them will get jobs. 1%. Let's try to finish. Kim?
Okay, thank you, Lauren. I'm trying to think about the implications of what you're saying. And I keep going back to something that has not really been talked about today, that most of us in the room should have at least these questions, I would think, come up. And that is, if this hegemony is so incredibly powerful, how can we explain the 60s? And that whole process. And even more so, I want to take this to a much even greater degree. And that was, as some of you know, I went in the Marine Corps in 1969. I do not have a hint of progressive ancestry in my background. I don't even have a trade unionist in my background. Volunteered to go in the Marine Corps in 69, volunteered to go to Vietnam as a door gunner on a helicopter, fortunately not set. And yet, many like me, and I was much further on the edge than a lot of people, turned around and joined an anti-war movement inside the United States military under conditions where you'd probably less expect something like this emerge than could ever be imagined. And yet it was because of our efforts, and in light of the Vietnamese willingness to sustain any cost, of course, but it was because the anti-war movement grew within the U.S. military, both in Vietnam, in Europe, and in the United States, that ultimately the United States was forced to back out of Vietnam. How does something like that, and you can see it in that great movie, Sir No Sir, it's really illuminated there. How can we explain that rise in the face not only of hegemony in general, but after people going through boot camp, which at least in the Marine Corps, they literally told us, we're going to tear your entire personality apart that it's taken you 17, 18, 19 years to generate, and we're going to reshape you as a Marine. And God damn it, they did a pretty fucking good job. Yet, we still were able to build an anti-war movement within the military, challenging racism, challenging the authoritarianism of the Marine Corps, challenging the war, all of this. How can that be explained in the face of this hegemony theory that you're putting out?
Well, it's not an easy answer. But let me, you know, pretty much agree with you on a lot. Let me just point out that I started the discussion of Gramsci with Gramsci's critique of Gramsci's observations of how the power of the church kept people from joining the unions. What is the power of the church in Italy today? They can't even elect an Italian pope. Has anybody who's been to Italy? You know that every Sunday the churches are filled and filled and filled with American and Japanese tourists taking pictures of the building. Okay, so the point here, and then Gramsci's clear on this, that hegemony is not all powerful. It has to constantly be renewed because it creates the conditions of oppression and domination which foster rebellion. Some people, for reasons having to do with maybe you were bounced on your head as a baby, give it up and and shift their positions. That ultimately there's always the opportunities, and that the conditions of oppression are the very conditions that underlie hegemony, and that I think that Gramsci shows that it's not all powerful, but it needs to be constantly reversed, constantly renewed, and creates opportunities for counter-hegemonic intellectuals like you. Peter.
Well, thank you very much for, again, a fascinating and enjoying talk I enjoyed listening to. I don't want to quibble, but actually Gramsci wasn't from Sicily, he was from Sardinia.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Why is that significant?
Sardinia.
Sardinia, because
Yeah.
if you're from Sardinia, what is some
If
of
you
the
were in
things
Sicily,
there?
it would have been, you would have been organizing for the mafia.
Well, it's an ethnic minority, right, Sardinians, which were discriminated against by other Italians. They spoke a different dialect of Italian, and Gramsci himself suffered great abuse for his, so to speak, non-Italian accent. Third, most importantly, there were mainly peasants. It was a rural society. Now, one of the things that I think that explains, one of the great things about Gramsci is that when he became a Marxist activist in Turin in northern Italy in the 20s before he was incarcerated, he recognized one of the great historical failures of socialism in Italy up to that point was the failure to overcome the gap between the urban proletariat and the peasantry largely in the southern Italy and in areas like Sardinia. That is, the peasants were written off as reactionary or suffering from rural idiocy. And he argued vociferously against that position, and he tried to push the Marxists in the direction of recognizing the revolutionary potential of this form of this subjectivity. Now, why am I raising that is, today, this is relevant in certain contexts. I mean, after all, some of the most exciting social movements against capitalism occurring in the world are occurring among peasants, rural individuals like in the Andes, etc. The movements there. So I think we have to be, I mean, look, I like Marx too, but there's certain phrases of Marx that we should put to rest. One of them is this notion of rural idiocy. Now, why am I raising that? The reason is because the one thing we can't afford to present ourselves as leftists is as if we know, we understand, we're free from all of these, what Marx called the muck of the ages. We don't have any of that because we're enlightened. And these people, they're voting, they're doing all these terrible things, they don't understand their self-interest, some of which is true, a lot of it which is true. Putting ourselves up on a pedestal above them, when in fact we're all in different respects subject to these kinds of contradictions. And I think that specifically where we can learn from Gramsci in terms of counter-hegemonic, even though he didn't talk about this himself, but applying his methodology. But the peasant question was for Italy. The race issue is for the United States. And that has a lot to do with why people vote against their own self-interest, is because of the importance of racism. And it also has to do with Kim's point. A lot of the reason what woke a lot of people up in the 60s was the power of the struggle against racism. So to the extent that the left doesn't recognize the vital importance of that dimension of liberation might explain some of its own isolation. So lastly, when Gramsci made that statement, he says, the philosopher of praxis does not put themselves outside the contradiction, but posits themselves as part of the contradiction and makes themselves, therefore, an element of action and knowledge. I think we should kind of follow his advice on that.
I have nothing to say, absolutely. Absolutely. And Peter knows this, but for the people that don't, I've long been a participant in the World Social Forum, and among the major voices, not always within the forum itself, are Via Campesina and the MST, the movement of the landless peasants. And I don't think, if anybody's ever heard of some major social revolutions in the 20th century, you know, has anybody ever heard of the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution, or the Cuban Revolution? These are peasant revolutions. These are all peasants, and of course, you know, I mean, I can't, there's nothing that you said I couldn't agree with. Let's try to close it up with one quick one.
Sure, I'll try and be really quick. You made a statement about how it's pointless to talk to libertarians about government aid, and that was a very good and cutting statement. I have kind of unique perspective on these things because on the one hand, I'm pretty much a Bolshevik, but on the other hand, I'm also a traditional Catholic. And so I move in very different circles, and I see very different kinds of people. On Facebook the other day, I got Joe Scheidler as a friend suggestion. I know 6 people Joe Scheidler, the anti-abortion activist, knows. And right below him was somebody who knew 8 of my friends, Bill Ayers. So you can see, you know, I work in very different circles. And I would have to say that if you talk to religious people about economic issues, you can talk to them about leftism. I was at a Christmas party for, some friends who are active in the anti-abortion movement. It was so conservative there that they were singing their Christmas carols in Latin. And 2/3 of those people said to me, when I started talking to them about it, that they would favor socialized medicine. They would favor a single-payer system as long as abortion were kept out of it. So you can talk to them about leftism as long as it's economic leftism and you leave the social issues alone. That's my only point.
Being at a Catholic university, a Jesuit university that is largely committed to social justice, I couldn't agree stronger. And a number of people raise questions about why people, how can they, how can a good Catholic university have people like me and David around? It's a lot easier for us at a place like Loyola than it would be at the University of Illinois, where you're going to get some of these idiots of rural life going, I don't want my tax dollar going to support them communists subverting our youth. So I think the point is that, and this is an important aspect of the politics that I didn't discuss, there are various kinds of strategic alliances. And that, of course, I think this is why I think religion is a little bit more complex than just hegemony. Because the other side of it, as Durkheim pointed out, even though he was an atheist, his father was a rabbi, religion does provide people with a sense of community. I said that. My question is, every religion, whether it's Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, has its authoritarian side and its humanistic side. And part of the reason that church is moving away from American Catholics is they're just about right to vote. American Catholics think it's okay to be gay and, and for women to be ordained, etc., etc. That they're writing Americans off. There's no hope for them. But, there are many places where we can. I've been more or less, not too much lately, but tied in with Tikkun, which is a Jewish peace organization. That I don't see any big conflict of this, because any kind of progressive change does require very broad alliances, and these alliances have to be able to resolve our differences. I think we're out of time, and I'm going to thank you.
Yeah, we got to put a wrap on. Thank you.